Good evening. Welcome to Community and Technology, where we connect the global community with news, information, and resources that we hope will help improve your life. I'm Stu Reid. I'm here by myself today. My buddy and co-host Dave Burstein is on travel, but we have a very special guest going to make this a really good show. Dr. Jack Poulson is the Executive Director of Tech Accountability Nonprofit, Tech Inquiry. He completed his PhD in computational and applied mathematics at the University of Technology in Austin in 2012 before serving as an assistant professor of computational science and engineering at Georgia Tech, then as an assistant professor of mathematics at Stanford University. Dr. Poulson, welcome to Community and Technology.
Thanks for having me, Stu.
Yeah, well, it's a pleasure. Tell us a little bit about your organization, Tech Inquiry. What's it all about?
Yeah, so we started in 2019 as a group of tech workers who had been at tech companies who were violating human rights in various ways, whether that was work on drone surveillance, artificial intelligence at Google, or a startup named Clarify, or in my case, Google was rolling back a decade-long stance that it had on the protection of human rights and its search engines internationally. And so over time, we've evolved into a core competency, if you will, that is monitoring global purchasing by governments of weapons and surveillance, especially from tech companies.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You mentioned a rollback at Google. I understand just from reading some of the background about you that at one point you were a research scientist with Google in the AI division, but you resigned. What was that all about?
Yeah, so I was at Google for about 2.5 years. I got there in mid 2016. I ended up leaving or towards the end of 2018. The company had secretly been working to build a localization of its search engine, which would be specifically tailored to the demands of the Chinese government in this case. And it was found through a combination of investigative reporting and employees of the company digging around in the source code that, for example, one of the things that would be done would be blacklisting the term human rights in certain circumstances. There was a refusal of the company to say what types of queries they would be willing to comply with surveillance requests over. For example, I had asked the head of AI research at Google, would Google refuse a surveillance demand if a Chinese citizen literally searched for the term human rights? And it was refused to be clarified to me. Essentially the argument was that the US, for example, has FISA warrants. And so therefore, it would be hypocritical of Google not to comply with essentially whatever government demands it receives internationally. Obviously, that's a bit of a fatalist perspective, and I certainly am critical of the types of surveillance demands the US government would have. But I would say primarily the fact that the company refused to even clarify what it was actually doing was part of the reason that I was no longer comfortable working there.
Mm-hmm. Wow. As I read through some of the work of Tech Inquiry and listening to some of the stuff that you're talking about just now, I mean, it really strikes me, and maybe I'm naive to say this, but it strikes me that big tech is really the arms merchants of today. Would that be a fair statement?
Yeah, so there's a report that was actually put out by the Action Center on Race and the Economy, or ACRE, last year that was literally titled "Big Tech Sells War." Some of our work was used for the research in that report. I think it's fair to say that the largest contracts between governments and tech companies are for very large cloud computing contracts, either with, for example, the Central Intelligence Agency for, quote, tens of billions of dollars, or the upcoming Department of Defense cloud contract for $9 billion, which is the Joint Warfighting Cloud Capability Contract. And then there was also a secret $10 billion NSA cloud computing contract, which was called Wild and Stormy, which only became public as a result of a bid protest that was reviewed by the Government Accountability Office. And so certainly, the towering contracts between governments and tech companies are for intelligence and defense.
Mm-hmm. Now, Jack, I grew up in the 60s. So, my perspective, any kind of contracting with the CIA is, anathema. And that's really a negative thing. Now, is there any possibility that, some of these contracts are good or somehow work to help folks, maybe say in Ukraine and their struggles, or characterize that for me? I mean, is it fair to say that a company that has major contracts with the CIA is, quote, evil? Break that down for us.
Yeah, that's definitely a big question. I think it's fair to say that there is no transparency over what the scope of these contracts are. There's really only half acknowledgements of the roles of these companies. Several of the 5 recipients of the C2E contract with the CIA, which is the commercial cloud environment for the tens of billions, they've acknowledged it. There's numerous articles reporting this out from, if you will, the kind of government contracting press, which isn't exactly left wing. But obviously the CIA has been involved in torture scandals in the post 9/11 era. It's been involved in coups around the world. On the subject of Ukraine, yes, it has been involved in training troops to help defend against the invasion. I think it's fair to say the role of the CIA is to protect the interests of the United States government and its, let's say, its industry. Mm-hmm. And so the degree to which those industries have interests which are counter to human rights, I think it's fair to say that's what's being supported when you contract with the CIA.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk a little some specifics. I know you talk a little bit about a company called Anomalysix.
Right.
What is that company all about? They're a secretive government contractor. Is that correct?
Yeah. So Anomalysix essentially spun off from a much larger, though still relatively small, defense contractor named Babel Street. Babel Street primarily focuses on what you might call open source intelligence gathering, though the definition of what's, quote, open might be contested. So Babel Street's core strengths are, for example, surveillance of social media, whatever language it's in. They might translate it into English and make it easily indexable. They also sell location tracking data on cell phones to various governments. And that data is, according to government contracts I've gotten a hold of from Babel Street, primarily comes from ad tech location tracking. And effectively what happened was that 2 of the senior employees at Babel Street, Brendan Clark and, Brendan Huff, and then a 3rd employee was Brendan Clark, it decided that they were going to start their own company and essentially steal the contract from Babel Street and just have it as their own within their startup. And this contract was actually with a company named ECS Federal, which, having spoken a bit about Google's work on drone surveillance earlier, ECS Federal is actually the major prime contractor for Project Maven, which was the Pentagon's primary effort for incorporating AI into, for example, drone surveillance. And so Babel Street sued the employees of Anomalysix, saying that their location tracking product had really just been ripped off. And Anomalysix got a couple of contracts with US Special Operations Command, and then someone reached out to me with a recording of a sales pitch that Anomalysix had with a social media surveillance company named Signal Labs. And in that pitch, it was made, Anomalysix claimed that it could track billions of cell phones. It claimed that you really didn't need satellite surveillance in a lot of cases because you could predict, for example, troop movements through monitoring the cell phone locations of known members of the military, kind of predict deployments. There's a lot that could be said about the company, but suffice it to say their core competency is buying through apps that are installed on people's phones with loose permissions, very large amounts of that location data, and then selling it to Department of Defense officials and potentially broader intelligence community members.
Jack, is this something that everyday folks should be concerned about? I know that one thing is the military targets, but are civilians involved in this data collection, and how might it be used?
Absolutely. So this is primarily through the commercial market. And you can think of the point of this type of surveillance is avoiding the need for a search warrant. So once there is a commercial market, it will be used for things like surveilling union organizers. That's something I wish I could talk about more, but unfortunately I can't at this time. But it's pretty straightforward how you would translate the types of things that Anomalysix has done to, for example, a company like Amazon trying to keep tabs on what sorts of union organization activity is taking place. One of the primary techniques that's used is something called a geofence. So really what that means is that you draw a box around a particular area. Maybe it's an Amazon warehouse, maybe it's, in the case of Anomalysix, the CIA or the NSA, and you say, I'm going to filter down to all of the devices that have traveled between, say, the CIA and the NSA, or an Amazon warehouse and maybe a union headquarters. And then I'm going to monitor those devices in relatively real time and see who they congregate with, and then use that to spider out and kind of build up a network of people to monitor. And so, yeah, I mean, nothing about these techniques are fundamentally restricted to the military. The data source is in no way restricted to the military. A lot of location tracking data was also used for COVID analysis, fairly prominently by the New York Times. Many other newspapers, including ProPublica, actually experimented with that data. There's a lot that could be said about the nonprofits that promoted that. In particular, the Center for New Data was the primary one there. But really, once a market is created, think of it as, you've got a hammer and you're looking for nails now. And there are a lot of nails to hit with location tracking data.
Now, what would you recommend for folks? I know there's so many applications that require the location data for them to really effectively work. I mean, what would you say to the average U.S. citizen about location tracking on their phone and what they should do or not do? Do you have any advice on that?
Yeah, I mean, the easiest recommendation is to be very careful which apps you install on your phone, and to vet where it comes from. I know that's easier said than done, but another recommendation would be to actually have a separate phone if you're, say, a political activist or a union organizer, which you only install the absolute bare minimum applications on. And then if you're doing any sort of sensitive activity, only bring the locked down phone with you. So for example, on my own personal devices, I have a dedicated phone just for secure conversations that I really don't install anything on. And so I think that's actually generally good advice, given how loose the permissions are on a lot of applications. To, if you really care about, a major corporation or a government surveilling your activities, you probably, don't want to install arbitrary, like flashlight apps or, and in fact, dating apps have been some of the major sources. And there was a Muslim prayer app even called Muslim Pro that was found to have been selling its data through a series of intermediaries, including a company named Xmode Social that was then ending up in the hands of US Special Operations Command, as well as, in fact, the Defense Intelligence Agency.
Wow. So, I mean, as far as I know, that there is no overarching application on a phone that would just kind of blanketly turn off location data. Is there, or is there any application that you could install that would turn location data on and off?
So there have been lawsuits, for example, against Google that they had in the past made it seem as if you could turn off your location data easily and they were still collecting. So definitely be aware that there is sometimes active deception on those fronts. But I would also say, think of location tracking data as something that comes at multiple levels of granularity. One of the easiest ways to get a rough idea is actually just which Wi-Fi networks you are near. So even if someone does not have access to your GPS location, if they had access to the fact that you are near your home's Wi-Fi, they know you're pretty close to your house. And likewise, if there was a broader map of Wi-Fi networks, that's one of the ways to locate you. And so, obviously, another famous one is that if you're near a particular cell phone tower, that gives a very rough sense of your location. Even your IP address gives a very rough sense of your location. And so it really is a question of what level of granularity you're talking about. GPS, you might think of a couple of meters up to maybe, 30 meters or so, somewhere in that range. But there are much coarser versions of detecting your location that are possible through other means.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it really sounds like as long as you have a mobile phone, there's nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. That's what it sounds. That's kind of what I'm hearing.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think people should be fatalist, but it's fair to say a phone is a tracking device that we all have on us. Mm-hmm. And the best thing to do is to minimize the number of let's say hostile parties that might have access to that location data.
Wow, interesting. Now, just to switch gears a little bit, I saw something about a hologram studio in Brooklyn that you wrote about, something called Greenpoint.
Looking Glass.
Greenpoint neighborhoods, Looking Glass Factory. But what is that all about, Jack?
Yeah, so what's a bit interesting is that I think a lot of people are familiar with the venture capital arm of the US intelligence community, which is known as In-Q-Tel. Mm-hmm. But what a lot of people are less familiar with is that it's actually a 501c3 nonprofit. And so wow. What that means is that they're legally required to disclose quite a lot of information every year. And you can find this in numerous places publicly. And so one of the things they have to disclose is who are their top 5 independent contractors and how much money did they pay those contractors in the last calendar year. They also have to disclose what are the salaries of the executives, which at In-Q-Tel turns out to be several $1 million a year, even though it's government-funded nonprofit. And the second highest recipient in 2021, in the year ending in March 2021, was a company known as Looking Glass Factory, which if you look them up, they just build holograms and their headquarters is in Brooklyn. And so it was a bit of a shock because this company really doesn't advertise that, the CIA or the FBI might be their major customers, but according to the so-called 990 filings that In-Q-Tel had to submit for tax purposes, they received, if I recall correctly, $2.4 million in that 12-month period from the venture capital arm of US intelligence. Mm. And so, one could talk about the broader scope of military investment in virtual and augmented reality. But this case was interesting really because they're such a cutesy, if you will, kind of cartoons and art oriented company that it was quite a contradiction.
This company converts images to holograms. Is that correct?
Yeah, so they have a display that they sell, which is really, you know, a much more sophisticated version of what you might have seen on like a, you know, a holographic baseball card or something, where if you turn it at a different angle, you see the image slightly transform. But they build displays which have, you know, if I recall correctly, it's about 100 different angles that you can view it at, and it's much larger. It can sit on your desk for a few $100s. And it's fairly easy for you to record a video on your phone and then insert that hologram into the device. And so the understanding that one could get from the little public information there is on how they've interacted with, for example, the Air Force, is that the US military would like to build holographic displays which do not require headsets. And so that's really the appeal, is that they want to seed the market of commercial companies, which are building holographic or 3D interfaces that a whole team of people can look at once.
Mm-hmm. Now, Jack, do you think this is something that should be disclosed by a company like Looking Glass? What do you see as the ethics of their work and their accepting funding from CIA?
Yeah, certainly it would be nice if they responded to a request for comment on this, which they did not. But really, it's hard to say what they're doing when they don't disclose what the sale is. Again, if I had to guess, I would say it's similar to what they're selling to the Air Force. And so honestly, I would think of it as something much less controversial than, for example, selling cloud computing to the defense departments or the CIA, because there are very severe implications. So, for example, if you look at the way that the head of Oracle in Israel speaks about their cloud computing contracts with the Israeli government, they're actually attacking Google because they're saying that Google might allow the International Criminal Court to prosecute Israel through war crimes that the IDF might have committed. And so I would say, in the realm of cloud computing, which really dominates in tech money flows for the most part, there are very active considerations for shielding governments from prosecution for even severe actions, whereas, which I might say is quite a bit more material than, for example, did you build, a holographic display that is fairly black box. And with that said, a much more concerning case, also in terms of the raw money flow in the augmented reality world, is Microsoft's $22 billion contract with the US Army. And I say 22 billion in terms of sort of the maximum ceiling, even though the actual total spend would likely be much lower than that. What Microsoft has been selling is a set of goggles for troops in the Army, which would, one, provide the equivalent of night vision, seeing through smoke, but also helping to detect targets, to as they promoted quite a bit, to see around corners and to be able to shoot around corners. And so there have been a lot of problems with that. I would say, beyond the question of the active support for warfare that such technology might provide, it's actually, there's been a lot of concern that it just frankly doesn't function properly, and that it's a very large boondoggle. So there was a report put out by I believe it was the Inspector General of the Department of Defense, that said that the program could waste as much as $22 billion of taxpayer money. And that report was based upon an earlier somewhat controlled report that was put out, but was censored by claiming it was controlled unclassified information, which made clear that troops really couldn't even distinguish friends from enemies when they were wearing these goggles. And it was leading to headaches, neck strain, the batteries were wearing out, the visors were breaking. And in fact, the head of this program, which is called the Integrated Visual Augmentation System, or IVAS, was a Microsoft employee named Alex Kipman. And over the last couple of weeks, he actually ended up resigning over very long-standing sexual harassment issues.
Wow.
There'd also been reporting that over 100 employees that were working on this project, which more broadly was called HoloLens at Microsoft, had left for Facebook's work in augmented reality. And so the project's really been in a lot of trouble. And I would say, speaking in terms of actual concrete harm or ethics, I think the IVAS program is a much more interesting example.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we've been speaking with Dr. Jack Poulson, who's the executive director of tech accountability nonprofit Tech Inquiry. We're going to take a brief break and be right back. This is Community and Technology on WHCR 90.3. Stay tuned. Okay, we're back. This Community and Technology on WHCR 90.3. We're speaking with Dr. Jack Poulson, Executive Director of Tech Inquiry. Jack, before the break, we're talking a little bit about technology and its impact through military contracting on regular folks. One of the things that I wanted you to talk about a little more detail is social media and what's going on with that and from your perspective.
Yeah, so the so-called Project Maven effort from the Pentagon, which fairly purposefully by the Department of Defense was always referred to as purely about drone surveillance work, was actually a much broader effort involving other forms of AI surveillance by the Department of Defense. The sort of easiest analog from drone surveillance is doing the same sort of analysis that you would from drone imagery on satellite imagery. The reasons for that are quite clear. I think that we just don't have drones flying everywhere overhead. And so if you want to analyze an area where there isn't a drone, you fall back to satellite imagery. More broadly, if one digs through the types of so-called subcontracts that took place on this effort, one notices that beyond the computer vision side, there was a large effort for building what's called an enclave for publicly available information. And so this acronym, publicly available information, or PAI, is somewhat of a term of art. It really just means everything that isn't classified that the Department of Defense might be able to accumulate and potentially share with its allies, whether that's, you know, Israel or Saudi Arabia. It's hard to say what level of information sharing they might have, but that's broadly speaking the type of thing they might share. And if you look through the types of contractors that participated in this so-called PAI enclave, one of them is a very famous company called Palantir, which was co-founded by Peter Thiel, who's become quite the lightning rod ever since he came out publicly in support of Donald Trump during Trump's campaign. He's continued to be a major supporter of Republican candidates. But the more important side of things is that really Palantir's strength is what you might call data fusion, which is taking numerous data sources that might, you know, be fairly messy, cleaning them up, and then building ways for different organizations to have very complicated levels of access to that data. And so in the case of these so-called publicly available information enclaves, you might have 10, 20 different defense contractors that each provide their own unique set of data. And Palantir would play the role, you know, fairly certain, though it's not quite explicit, in the contract of being the company that controls how, for example, a government user would access the data, but, you know, perhaps the contractor would not know which government agency was querying its data. So for example, if the FBI contracts with the social media surveillance company, you definitely don't want the average employee at that company to know that the FBI is doing a particular query, because that would, you know, for example, compromise an investigation potentially. And so the thing to really take away from this is that there are numerous companies which very actively harvest, you know, for example, everything on Twitter, a large amount of collection of Facebook data that's public, and then sell that in a easily indexable way, often translated into English, kind of package for really anybody who wants it to search through it.
Jack, when you talk about this concept of fusion, is it correct to say that it's about pulling together different data sets from different sources and kind of compiling them and focusing them to give a more holistic picture of an individual or an organization? Is that what fusion is?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. That think of really that the sum of the parts is more than that of the pieces is often the case. So, you know, for example, if you have a tweet that happened to have been geotagged near a particular location of, let's say, a protest, maybe you could also find that protest through satellite imagery or through drone surveillance that the police might have been flying overhead. These sorts of things were definitely happening during Black Lives Matter, where companies like Data which is actually a very close partner of Twitter, was very much helping police surveil the protesters. And so the idea is basically that, like, for example, if it's something on Twitter, you don't know if it's real. And so you really need some way to confirm whatever you get from any somewhat questionable data source. But then also, maybe you had some location tracking data from someone's cell phone that placed them near the particular protest that they tweeted at. And so then you could actually extrapolate where they went before and after that protest. I think to some degree, a lot of these techniques are not so secret if you look at the type of work that the so-called open source intelligence community does. But when the Department of Defense or any intelligence agency does their equivalent of what we see these OS centers do, they have much more powerful surveillance, but they're doing all the same techniques of, very carefully combining really whatever data source they can get their hands on.
Mm-hmm. Now, just connect this again with the concept or notion that you spoke of earlier, PAI enclave. Where does that fit? And just kind of break that down again for us and how that fits into what you were just talking about.
Yeah, so, the US government is not primarily composed of programmers. I think that's a fair statement. And, especially since 9/11, there's been an increasing amount of privatization of the way that US government does sophisticated tasks, whether that's through software contractors or even in the case of, troops through companies like Blackwater historically. But because there are so many different data sets to gather, and each particular data set, you might, get the best version of it from a particular company. Then you need some way to really combine together all of the different offerings from, potentially dozens of companies in a way that's consistent and stored, according to whatever legal regulations you might be under. And so, for example, there is a company named Yonder, which went under several different names. Legally, it was named Populi, but it had actually been involved historically in a scandal where it made disinformation that was meant to look like Russian support for a Republican candidate. I believe it was in Georgia. And they ended up being caught for this and apologizing. Anyway, this company is actually one of the providers to the Department of Defense historically for social media data. And if you look through what the purchase information states, it claims that they are providing access to social media under the terms of service of the social media companies. And so a really core concept here is that there's often very different legal regulations on what a government can collect itself versus what it can buy from a company. And so there's a famous Supreme Court case, and to be clear, I'm not a lawyer, nor do I pretend to be one, but called Carpenter, which stated effectively that the United States itself cannot track your cell phones without a warrant. But there is no equivalent regulation that says that they cannot buy access to your cell phone's location from a company that already collected it. And so think of, that somewhat in-run around legal protections as being another major component at play here. But the other thing to keep in mind is that anytime the Department of Defense or any government agency starts really doing a lot of work to combine data sets, then they really don't want that to be, hacked into or stolen by whoever their competitors are. And so in the case of this so-called publicly available information enclave. It's actually run by the US Army in something called the Secure Unclassified Network. And so there's going to be a lot of work in, actually protecting this data and to monitor whatever cyber intrusions might be taking place. And so it's a significant effort to maintain the stockpile, even though, as I stated before, none of it's classified. It's still immensely useful once you've accumulated it all together.
I'm amazed just listening to you, Jack, about how so many of these technology companies, social media companies are really acting as operatives for the government, wittingly or unwittingly, just by virtue of all the data that they collect and the fact that they sell it and it's available. Would that be a fair statement?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of these companies have taken the view that that role is necessary to protect the United States against, for example, China. And so there's been a very concerted, if you will, narrative that's arisen that China might catch up with the United States in terms of technology development and then ultimately surpass it. And a lot of these companies, for example, Palantir, for example, Anduril, very much like to speak in terms of this binary of the US being the force for democracy in the world and China being the force for autocracy, and that building up the US military is by definition promoting democracy. And I would say that narrative, let's say, gets complicated if you talk about what happens with US support for example, Saudi Arabia's military, the UAE. In fact, one of the companies I named just a couple of minutes ago, Yonder, which again is legally known as Populi, was recently bought by another social media surveillance defense contractor named Primer Technologies. And Primer has actually been invested in by the government of the UAE. If I could check real quick if that was an investment. But certainly there's varying degrees of comfort. And, for example, Anduril has presented at military expos in the Middle East, but they really don't like to respond to questions about, have they actually completed those sales to such governments? And so, it's fair to say that the rhetoric involving the US as a force for democracy really tries to avoid the question of Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And in fact, especially since the invasion in Ukraine has largely, at least temporarily, shifted to asserting that the US military is by definition a force for good.
Okay, we have about maybe 3, 4, 5 minutes left. Let's talk a little bit about what's going on with facial recognition. What are some of the things that we should be looking at, concerned about?
Yeah, so interestingly enough, the facial recognition providers, for example, Clearview AI, have adopted the same rhetoric that the defense contractors like Palantir and Anduril have, which is to say that if the US does not, if you will, out-surveil China, that we will lose out on civil liberties. Because if the dominant providers of facial recognition are not based in the US, then the argument goes that the other companies will not respect our rights. So that was actually stated quite clearly in an open letter that the CEO of Clearview AI sent out at the beginning of this year. And Clearview AI is advertising that it has collected tens of billions of photos that they've scraped from social media all around the world, including support for the Ukrainian army through scraping Yandex, which is sort of a Russian equivalent of Facebook, And then that information was actually used for propaganda purposes. It was sent actually to the mothers of fallen Russian soldiers to show what sorts of horrible things happened to their children, along with their identification. Essentially, this rhetoric of U.S. versus China is really penetrating all sides of policy. Another important area it touches, which does impact consumers, is antitrust. It might not be a surprise to anyone that for years all of the essentially all of the major tech CEOs have been saying, if you break us up, then really all that's going to happen is that Chinese competitors will take over. And so yeah, I think it's a bit of a a rhetoric question, but I think it's hard to overstate the influence on policy of those framings.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we're talking with Dr. Jack Poulson, Executive Director of the Tech Accountability Nonprofit Tech Inquiry. In the few minutes we have remaining, Jack, maybe you can just talk a little bit about the importance of your organization. And I know no other organization quite like it. Just kind of put it in perspective, what it does and why it's important.
Well, I mean, I don't know how important we are. I think we definitely work very hard to provide analysis that I don't think is coming out anywhere else, which is a very detailed tracking of what different governments are procuring from around the world. One of the things we added recently was a mirror of what the Israeli government has been procuring. For example, which US tech companies are they buying cloud computing from? What sorts of surveillance contracts do they have? I think trying to move towards a global understanding of the relationships between even US tech companies with various governments is something that can be fairly revealing when you look comparatively. There's a lot of conclusions I have that I unfortunately can't share before our next report comes out, but I'm very much looking forward to that release. But I'll say that there's been quite a few stories that resulted from our findings. Whether that was the fact that cryptocurrency companies like Coinbase had active contracts with US Immigration and Customs Enforcement, Clearview AI's contracts with the US Air Force to build augmented reality goggles. Really, if there's a contract that came out today that involves weapons or surveillance, there's a very good chance we saw it. And we try to contextualize that as in a meaningful way.
Mm-hmm. How can folks find out more about your organization, Jack?
So we have a tool that we release publicly for digging through up-to-date contracts at techinquiry.org. And there's a little search box in the top right. And if you just start typing in a company name, whether that's Microsoft or Meta or Palantir, Anduril, Clearview AI, whatever, it'll pull up their feed and you can just do some research yourself on what sorts of relationships companies have, not only with governments, but also between each other. And, we didn't get into this, but what relationships do they have with nonprofits?
Okay. Well, thank you, Jack. We've been speaking with Dr. Jack Poulson, Executive Director of the Tech Accountability Nonprofit Tech Inquiry. Thank you so much, Jack, for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Stu.
Okay. Thanks for tuning in, folks. It's been Community and Technology on WHCR 90.3 FM, the voice of Harlem. See you next week, every Wednesday, 5 to 6 p.m. Good night.